Really very pleased to introduce Dr. Rebecca Morgan, who's joining us today. Dr. Morgan is a health research methodologist and epidemiologist. As an assistant professor at McMaster University in the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact in Hamilton, Ontario. She's also adjunct assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University, the School of Medicine in Cleveland, Ohio. Much of Dr. Morgan's research on evidence synthesis and guideline development is focused on advancing methods for assessing environmental and occupational exposures. She joined the GRADE working group in 2009 and has extensive experience in teaching systematic review and guideline development methods to national and international audiences. Dr. Morgan serves as a methodology consultant to global organizations such as the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the Infectious Disease Society of America, European Respiratory Society, Health Canada, and the World Health Organization. Dr. Morgan is a founding member of the US GRADE Network and the Executive Director of Evidence Foundation. Dr. Morgan.
Thank you so much, Ned. And thanks to the organizers for letting me present today. I think you can you can see my screen. Perfect. So again, thanks so much. I'm going to talk about some strategies for making recommendations based on limited or uncertain evidence. I'm very pleased to be talking about this. I have no financial disclosures, but as you heard in my background, I'm certainly a member of a number of methodological groups and serve as a methodologist to a number of associations. So during this presentation, I'm going to review the process for making useful recommendations, highlighting different factors considered in decision-making and how to present recommendation statements so that they are clear to the end user. Then I will provide a few strategies for when there is limited or insufficient evidence. As our objective is to make useful and trustworthy guidelines, it would be, of course, remiss to not recognize how far the National Academies has advanced the expectations for the development of guidelines with this set of 8 criteria published in 2011. Of these, I want to speak more about the strategies for developing useful recommendations in situations of limited certainty evidence. What I will talk about will fulfill the National Academy's criteria for creating trustworthy guidelines, specifically in reference to how we can provide a clear explanation of the logical relationships between alternative care options and health outcomes, and provide ratings of both the quality of evidence and the strength of recommendations. So guidelines are a way of answering questions, right, about clinical, communication, organizational, or policy interventions in the hope of improving healthcare or health policy. Therefore, it's helpful to structure a guideline in terms of answerable questions with a focus on relevant outcomes. I mentioned the relationship between the research question and the final recommendations to emphasize that in some contexts, these are not straightforward, such as in questions of exposure, and especially with limited evidence of the relationship between the intervention and outcome. So while ultimately we may be interested in making a recommendation that specifies a mitigating intervention to reduce exposure, direct evidence answering that question may be limited or non-existent for a variety of reasons. Therefore, we may need to take a step back and work stepwise through a series of questions to inform our main research question. So these would be that when little is known, we want to describe the nature of the relationship between the exposure and outcome. We want to analyze health effects at different exposure levels when naturally occurring exposure levels or cutoff points are unknown. To compare the association between a known exposure cutoff and a known comparison cutoff. And lastly, to identify exposure and comparator cutoffs with an established dose-response relationship with the outcome. The findings for any of these questions may directly or indirectly inform our predominant research question. When we talk about the body of evidence identified to answer our research question, within GRADE, there are 5 reasons why we might be uncertain in the findings. The first would be methodological limitations or risk of bias, inconsistency or heterogeneity, indirectness, imprecision, or publication bias. There are certainly also reasons for which we might have increased certainty. However, within the scope of this presentation, I'm going to focus on recommendations reflecting uncertain evidence. This slide presents how we would conceptualize the certainty in the body of evidence. When we have uncertainty about the body of evidence, this means that likely we're in a position of needing to provide a recommendation based on low or very low certainty evidence. The interpretation here is that the true effect between the exposure or intervention and comparison may or is likely substantially different than the estimate of effect that we are seeing. Decision-making is complex, even more so when there's uncertainty around the evidence. Fortunately, decision-making considers more than just the certainty of evidence. Our task is to make the considerations of those other factors explicit and transparent. So there are many different factors that need to be considered, including how important the problem is. So is the problem urgent or a priority? The balance between the desirable and undesirable effects. So do desirable effects outweigh the undesirable effects? When we talk about values and preferences, we're looking at, is there variability or uncertainty in how much people value the main outcomes? Whether the net benefits are worth the costs? Is there important difference or variability in the required resources? When considering impacts on health equity, we're asking, are there groups or settings who would be disadvantaged? Acceptability looks at, are the interventions acceptable to key stakeholders? And lastly, feasibility, is the implementation feasible to implement? It's these factors that need to be explicitly weighed to inform a recommendation. The GRADE evidence to decision framework details each of these factors in separate domains, which allows guideline developers to capture the available evidence and the discussion, which informs the final recommendation. Judgments about these factors are not necessarily equivalent in informing the final recommendation. Some may be larger drivers in the discussion or in the decision. Judgments made about each of these factors informs the final strength of the recommendation, whether strong or conditional, which sometimes is referred to as a weak recommendation. The strength of a recommendation reflecting the extent to which we can, across the range of persons for whom the recommendations are intended, be confident that the desirable effects of a management strategy outweigh the undesirable effects. When we consider the strength of a recommendation, there are some factors that would make a strong recommendation less likely. The first being lower certainty evidence. The lower the certainty of the evidence, the more likely one would be to make a conditional recommendation. Uncertainty about the balance of benefits versus harms and burdens means that the smaller the net benefit and the lower certainty for that benefit, the more likely a conditional recommendation is warranted. When there's uncertainty or differences in patients' values, so the greater the variability in the values and preferences, the more likely a conditional recommendation is warranted. And lastly, uncertainty about whether the net benefits are worth the costs. So the higher the cost of an intervention, that is, the more resources consumed, the less likely a strong recommendation is warranted. In the end, we are considering how clearly the benefits of one option outweigh the consequences. When either the benefits clearly outweigh the harms or the harms clearly outweigh the benefits, we're more likely to make a strong recommendation compared to when the options are more closely balanced. We would be more likely to make a conditional recommendation. Recommendations should be clearly written to benefit the user and reduce the risk of misinterpretation. Therefore, standardized wording should be used to reflect the direction and the strength of the recommendation. We could make a recommendation for or against, and within each, the strength of the recommendation could be strong or could be conditional. This slide provides some examples for wording of a strong recommendation, either for or against an intervention by using the word recommend. and wording of a conditional recommendation for or against by using the word suggest. A note on recommendations against an exposure or an intervention, we would want to avoid using "we do not recommend" as it can be misinterpreted, but instead using "we recommend against." Alternatively, we could choose to make a recommendation for the alternative instead of against the intervention. And then lastly, we want to maintain the comparator in the recommendation statement unless it's self-explanatory. When we talk about a stronger conditional recommendations, what are the implications of that? What do we mean? A strong recommendation means that for the population, most people in this situation would want the recommended course of action, and only a small proportion would not. For clinicians or healthcare workers, most individuals should follow the recommended course of action. Formal decision aids are not likely to be needed to help individual patients make decisions consistent with their values and preferences. For policymakers, the recommendations can be adopted as policy in most situations, and adherence to this recommendation according to the guideline could be used as a quality criterion or a performance indicator. And then lastly, for researchers, the recommendation is supported by credible research or other convincing judgments that make additional research unlikely to alter the recommendation. On occasion, a strong recommendation is based on low or very low certainty in the evidence, and this I'll talk about later in my presentation. And in some instances, further research may provide important information that alters the recommendation. A conditional recommendation, on the other hand, means that for the population, the majority of individuals in this situation would want the suggested course of action. However, many would not. Decision aids may be useful in helping patients to make a decision consistent with their individual values and preferences. Clinicians, different choices will be appropriate for individual patients, and providers must help each patient arrive at a management decision consistent with the patient's values and preferences. Decision aids, again, may be useful in helping individuals to make decisions. For policymakers, policymaking will require substantial debate and involvement of various stakeholders. Performance measures should assess whether decision-making is appropriate. And then lastly, for researchers, the recommendation is likely to be strengthened for future updates or adaptation by additional research and evaluation of the conditions and criteria that determine the conditional recommendation will help to identify possible research gaps. A few additional considerations when formulating recommendations to aid the user. First, we want to make statements actionable by avoiding statements of fact, such as palliative and supportive care is effective for patients with symptomatic advanced heart failure to improve quality of life. Instead, we want to tell the user what options should be used over the alternative. We want to avoid using statements insufficient evidence without providing more details about how that should be operationalized. For example, by turning it into a research recommendation, which I'll discuss on the next slide, or providing supplemental information. And then lastly, we want to keep the actual recommendation concise. There may be additional information, and that can be included in a subsequent remark or in the narrative of the guideline. What do we do if, when we have completed our evidence review and we feel that we were not able to identify the appropriate evidence to inform our recommendation? Whether there were no direct studies or the evidence was of low or very low certainty. One thought would be, if there is a sensible question, there will be evidence upon which to base our recommendation. That said, it may not come from the study designs that we had anticipated, whether those be randomized or non-randomized comparative studies. We may need to consider additional evidence, such as animal or laboratory data. By expanding the scope of the evidence considered, we might find that we actually have higher certainty in the indirect data, and it may be preferable to our lower certainty in the direct data. A recent study proposed 5 strategies to make insufficient evidence ratings and systematic reviews more actionable when the intention is to inform decision-making. So these build on a few of my previous slides by suggesting first to reconsider eligible study designs, such as inclusion of observational studies or studies without comparative arms. Secondly, summarize indirect evidence that may have not originally been eligible for the review. Third, summarize contextual or implementation evidence, as I mentioned earlier, which would include information about values and preferences, resource use, equity, acceptability, and feasibility. Consider a modeling, such as decision analysis if appropriate. And then lastly, incorporate unpublished health systems data in the evidence synthesis. So for example, a primary observational study that uses data from EMRs of the health system, this also might inform plans for implementation. In some situations of insufficient evidence, a research recommendation will be appropriate. And this is when the following 3 bullets are met. First, there is insufficient evidence supporting an intervention for the panel to recommend its use. Further research has a large potential for reducing uncertainty about the effects of the intervention. And then lastly, further research is deemed a good value for the anticipated costs. The following is an example of a research recommendation. Among ambulatory patients with mild to moderate COVID-19, the Infectious Diseases Society of America guideline panel recommends COVID-19 convalescent plasma only in the context of a clinical trial. The research recommendation recognizes a knowledge gap in this area. The research recommendation should be detailed regarding the specific research questions that investigators should address, and particularly which outcomes should be measured. The recommendations for research may be accompanied by an explicit strong recommendation not to use the experimental intervention outside of the research context. Does that mean that in situations with low or very low certainty evidence, only a conditional recommendation can be made? Not necessarily. However, 2 things to consider with this discussion. The first is that the majority of recommendations are conditional because they recognize some balance between the intervention and comparison, and further discussion with the benefactor of the guideline is needed. The second is that we want to avoid discordant recommendations, and discordant recommendations are strong recommendations based on low or very low certainty in the evidence. However, always however, there are 5 paradigmatic situations for which a strong recommendation based on low or very low certainty evidence can be made. So these are the following. There could be a life-threatening situation with a high baseline risk. It could be a situation of uncertain benefit but certain harm. A situation where one option is clearly less harmful or costly. The alternative, one option is clearly more harmful or costly. And lastly, there could be a situation of potential catastrophic harm. So let me give you one example for the scenario where one might have uncertainty about the benefit of an intervention, but some certainty about the harm. So this example considers a recommendation for head-to-toe CT MRI screening for early detection of cancer. After the evidence review and along with the guideline panel, the following information was noted. There was low certainty evidence of benefit of early detection, but high certainty evidence of possible harm. In addition, it was recognized that there is a high cost associated with the intervention, and it was felt that among patients, a higher value would be placed on the avoidance of harm from the intervention. Therefore, in this situation, the panel made a strong recommendation against the strategy of head-to-toe CT screening for early cancer detection. Where does this leave us? The first is that there are several points along the process where the scope may be adjusted to identify additional direct or indirect evidence, whether in the formulation of the research question or during the evidence review. Secondly, having low or very low certainty in the evidence can still be informative, as it should be considered alongside other factors that contribute to decision making. values and preferences, resource use, equity, acceptability, feasibility. Third, useful recommendations are those that use standardized, clear, and concise language to advise the end user. When guideline development groups feel that the evidence is too insufficient to make a recommendation, but that further research may be informative and is worth the cost, a research recommendation may be appropriate. And then lastly, avoiding discordant recommendations where there is a strong recommendation based on low or very low certainty evidence. Consider the implications of low certainty evidence that a conditional recommendation may be appropriate, meaning there's variability in the appropriate course of action. Across all of these steps, maintaining transparency of the judgments that lead to the final recommendation is paramount in the development of trustworthy guidelines. Here you will find a list of my references, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. That was excellent. I get to start with the first question. We have a few minutes. You know, I continue to have disagreement with the grade process around insufficient evidence, especially in the prevention world where people are otherwise well. And Holger knows that, as does Gordon, which is okay. I think it's okay to disagree. I look at the uncertainty. I always talk about it in the flip side. It's the risk of being wrong. And when you start thinking about the risk of being wrong, there are two ways to be wrong, right? You can make a type 1 error and say we should do it when maybe we shouldn't, or a type 2 error where you say we shouldn't do it where we really should. And I think in this setting of this environmental exposure and PFAS assessment, my worry kind of dwells more in the insufficient evidence, high risk of being wrong, but saying let's not do anything where we might be making a type 2 error. And I think the big part, and what I'd like to have you kind of espouse on, is the concept of the ramifications of being wrong in either direction. Of saying, boy, we should do this, test for it, do this test when we shouldn't. Or in this setting, we say the risk of being wrong is very high, and so we shouldn't do something, and the risk is saying we're making a mistake in that kind of type 2 direction. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And it's certainly something that I mull over quite frequently with guidelines. And certainly in the past year, you know, working on kind of the front lines of guideline development with COVID, where we really are missing a lot of information, and we do not want to err on the side of you know, we want to err on the side of caution and what is right. There's always the risk that you mention. I think what we can do to approach guidelines, you know, is to recognize that we are making judgments about the information that's available, and it's not just the evidence, right? The quality of the evidence. We're also looking at these other factors. So I think, you know, transparency in how we consider decisions. I think there also needs to be transparency in what our recommendation is and what underpins our judgment. You know, something that I hear not just from clinicians, from all guideline users, is if you're telling us that you have insufficient evidence, what do we do with that? You know, how do we make that actionable? And so I think, you know, any step to try and contextualize when there is a knowledge gap, what can people do in the meantime, or what would be the course of action, it seems to provide more than that, and is hopefully more helpful in practice.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks, Dr. Morgan. Are there questions from other committee members? Seeing none, again, thanks, Dr. Morgan. I'm going to stick around to participate with the rest of the panel.